Ma'am, you need to
You
step
will leave
away
this
from that
property
desk.
immediately.
This area
I am not
isn't for
leaving
guests
until
like
this is
you.
resolved, Mr.
The words
Thompson.
didn't
You don't have a
echo
choice.
loudly.
Yes, I
But
do.
they cut through the marble lobby with the precision of something practiced, something said before, something meant to land exactly where it hurt. And Ava Johnson didn't move. Not
What?
an inch.
What?
Not a breath out of place.
Is there a
Not even when
problem?
the front desk
There's a
agent
problem.
folded her arms and
Yes,
looked
I
her up
know.
and down like she was a mistake.
You can't just come in
waiting
here
to
and
be
change
corrected,
things. This is my
because
domain.
Ava had
Actually, it's
seen
mine
this
now. You're
before.
dismissed.
I'm not
in
going
this
anywhere.
exact
Security,
room.
escort
Not
her
under
out.
these
Security,
crystal
escort him out.
chandeliers
Now, you
or
are disrupting
beside these
operations.
polished
Security, remove her.
brass
I am the
fixtures.
CEO, Mr.
But in
Thompson. Please
100
release
other
the hold of my
places that
accounts
all
immediately.
felt
I can't
the
do that.
same
You're breaching
when people
contract.
No, you
decided
are.
who
Arrest
you were
him,
before
security.
you ever spoke.
All right,
And she
everything
had
is in
learned long
order.
ago
Let's
that
make sure this
silence
runs
wasn't
perfectly.
weakness. It was timing, and timing was everything. The lobby around her still carried the quiet
The data in
hum
this
of
quarter
a
is strong.
five-star hotel
Indeed,
at 10:12
CEO.
a.m.
We need to
Soft
leverage this
footsteps
momentum in
across
the next
imported
fiscal.
stone.
Absolutely.
The low murmur of conversations. The distant chime of an elevator opening somewhere behind frosted glass doors. Everything controlled, everything curated, everything designed to feel exclusive. And yet in that moment, it wasn't the space that defined who belonged. It was the people guarding it. And they had already made their decision. Ava stood there in dark jeans, a fitted black shirt, and simple sneakers. Nothing about her outfit screamed wealth. Nothing signaled authority, and that was intentional, because she didn't walk into her properties to be recognized. She walked in to see the truth, the unfiltered version, the one that didn't show up in reports or polished reviews or carefully worded internal audits. The one that only appeared when people thought no one important was watching, and right now, no one in that lobby thought she was important. Not the agent behind the desk, not the concierge pretending not to notice, not the man in a tailored suit checking his watch with quiet impatience. They all saw the same thing, or at least they thought they did. And that assumption was about to cost them everything. I have a reservation, Ava said, her voice calm, even, almost too calm for the tension slowly tightening in the air. She slid her ID across the marble counter, the card catching the light for just a second before it disappeared under the agent's hand. The woman barely glanced at it before setting it aside like it didn't matter. Penthouse suite, Ava added. And that was when the first shift happened, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of shift that doesn't need volume to carry weight. The agent's posture stiffened, her lips pressed into a line that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite a frown, just something in between that signaled disbelief wrapped in politeness. That suite is reserved for executive clients, she replied, her tone controlled but edged with something colder underneath, something that didn't bother hiding what it implied. Ava didn't respond right away. She didn't need to, because the room had already started to lean in, not physically, but in attention, in awareness, the way people do when they sense something is about to unfold. And it wasn't dramatic yet, not loud, not chaotic, but it was building, like pressure behind glass, and Ava could feel it, not as discomfort, but as confirmation. This was exactly why she was here. Run the name, she said simply, and for a brief second, the agent hesitated, not because she didn't understand, but because something in Ava's tone didn't match the image she had already decided on. It didn't fit, and that made it easier to dismiss, easier to double down. We don't just run names on request, the agent replied, and that was when the manager stepped in, as if summoned by tension alone. Daniel Brooks, mid-40s, crisp suit, controlled smile, the kind of presence that filled space without. Raising his voice, he approached with the confidence of someone who believed he understood the situation before hearing a single word. Is there a problem here? He asked, but he wasn't really asking. He was positioning, and the agent was quick to answer. She's claiming a penthouse reservation. The emphasis on the word claiming wasn't subtle, and Daniel's eyes moved to Ava, not quickly, not rudely, but with a measured scan that carried its own message, evaluation, judgment, conclusion, all in a matter of seconds. Ma'am, he said, the politeness carefully layered over something firmer. We need to verify all high-tier bookings, especially when there are discrepancies. Ava tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition. There it was, the system revealing itself, not through policy, but through tone, through assumption, through the quiet decision that something didn't add up, not because of data, but because of perception. And still, she didn't react emotionally. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, grounded, steady, as if the floor beneath her wasn't just marble, but something deeper, something earned. Across the lobby, a young woman near the seating area shifted in her chair, her phone halfway raised, not recording yet, just observing, while a bellman paused mid-step, glancing between Ava and the front desk, sensing the shift even if he didn't fully understand it, and in the reflection of the glass behind the counter, Ava caught a glimpse of herself, calm, composed, exactly as she had been the first time something like this happened years ago, back when she stood in a different lobby, younger, less certain, holding a confirmation email that no one believed belonged to her, back when she explained, clarified, justified, and still walked away feeling like she had to prove she deserved to be there. That version of her would have spoken more, tried harder to be understood, but that version didn't exist anymore. This version didn't explain, this version observed. There's no discrepancy, Ava said quietly, and the way she said it wasn't defensive, it was factual, final, like a statement that didn't need validation. Daniel's smile tightened just slightly, the kind of change most people wouldn't notice, but Ava did, because she had spent years reading rooms like this, decoding the subtle shifts that revealed more than words ever could. Then you won't mind waiting while we confirm, he replied, already turning slightly as if the conversation was decided, as if the outcome was already written, and that was the moment everything slowed, not in reality, but in perception, the way moments do when they carry weight beyond themselves. Ava's hand rested lightly on the counter, her fingers brushing against the edge where her card had been set aside, and for just a second, she looked at it, not because she needed it, but because of what it represented, not access, not money, but control, the kind of control that didn't need to be displayed to exist, the kind that didn't rely on recognition to be real. You should check again, she said, and this time, her voice carried something different, not louder, not sharper, but deeper, like a current beneath still water, and that was when the room shifted again, more noticeably now. The young woman in the seating area fully raised her phone. The bellman stopped completely, and even the man in the tailored suit looked up from his watch, drawn in despite himself, because something about Ava didn't match the narrative unfolding in front of him. Something didn't align. Daniel turned back, slower this time, studying her with a new layer of attention, not yet doubt, but no longer certainty, and for the first time, the system hesitated, just a fraction, just enough to matter, but not enough to stop what had already begun, because the truth hadn't been revealed yet, and until it was, the assumptions would hold, the roles would stay in place, and the room would keep watching, unaware that in just minutes, everything they thought they understood about power, about presence, about who belonged and who didn't, was about to be rewritten in a way none of them would forget. Daniel did not reach for the keyboard right away, and that hesitation was small, but visible, like a hairline crack forming in glass that had been perfect seconds earlier, and Ava saw it because she was not watching his words, she was watching the space between them, the micro pauses, the recalculations, the silent negotiations happening behind his eyes while he tried to maintain control of a situation he believed he understood, and that belief was the only thing still holding his authority together. The front desk agent shifted beside him, glancing from Ava to the system monitor and back again as if waiting for instruction, but also quietly hoping the situation would resolve itself without requiring her to make a decision that might later be questioned. The lobby air changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that people who had no involvement began to feel it, like a pressure drop before a storm. The man in the tailored suit straightened slightly, no longer pretending disinterest. The young woman with the phone adjusted her grip, now clearly recording, and even the concierge, who had been avoiding eye contact, lifted his gaze just enough to catch what was unfolding, and then quickly looked away as if distance could protect him from accountability. Ava remained still, her posture unchanged, her breathing, even her presence, anchored in a way that did not demand attention, but inevitably drew it, because stillness in a room that expected movement always stood out, and she understood that. She did not need to speak more, she did not need to argue, she only needed to allow the system to continue revealing itself. Go ahead, she said quietly, and the words were not a challenge, they were permission, and that made them more unsettling than if she had raised her voice, because permission suggested confidence, and confidence, without explanation, created uncertainty. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if resetting himself, then turned toward the terminal, his fingers hovering over the keyboard for a fraction longer than necessary before he began typing, the sound of the keys soft but sharp in the quiet lobby, each click echoing more than it should have, as if the room itself was listening for the result. The agent leaned closer, her eyes narrowing at the screen as lines of data populated fields that she had not expected to see, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and that silence stretched just long enough for the people watching to feel it. The kind of silence that made strangers look at each other without words, as if confirming that something was off. "Spell your last name," the agent said finally, but the question came out thinner than before, less certain. Ava did not look at her. She kept her gaze on Daniel, because he was the one who mattered now. He was the one holding the decision point, and she knew that in systems like this the person with authority rarely asked the questions out loud. They observed, they interpreted, and then they decided. "Johnson," Ava said evenly, and Daniel's fingers paused again, this time longer, this time undeniable, his eyes scanning the screen, not quickly, not casually, but with a focus that suggested something had appeared that did not align with his expectations. And that was when the second shift happened, not in the room, but inside him, because doubt had entered, and doubt, once introduced, did not leave quietly. The agent leaned in further. "Is it showing anything?" she whispered, but the whisper carried in the stillness, and a few heads turned more openly now, the boundaries between observer and participant thinning with each passing second. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he clicked into another window, another layer of verification, another attempt to confirm what he was seeing, and the more he clicked, the more his posture changed subtly, the rigid confidence softening into something more controlled, more cautious, as if he was beginning to understand that this situation was not going to resolve in the direction he had anticipated. Ava watched him without expression, but inside her memory moved not as distraction, but as context. A different lobby years earlier, a different man behind a desk telling her to wait just a few minutes while he checked something, and those minutes stretching into an hour, then two, while others walked past her, received their keys, their smiles, their welcome, while she stood there explaining again and again that her reservation was valid, that her name was correct, that she had done everything required, and still being treated like an exception to a rule that no one else seemed to follow. She remembered the feeling, not anger, not even frustration, but something quieter, something heavier, the realization that the system did not need to say the word no, because it could simply delay until you left on your own. And she remembered the moment she decided that one day she would build places where that would not happen, where silence would not be used as a filter, where presence would not be questioned based on perception. And now, standing here years later in a space built under her name, under her standards, under policies she had personally approved, she was watching the same pattern attempt to repeat itself, and that was what settled her even further, because this was not unfamiliar. This was confirmation. There is no reservation under that name, the agent said suddenly, and the words came too quickly, too sharply, like a reaction rather than a conclusion, and Ava did not look at her. She kept her focus on Daniel, because his silence contradicted the statement, and in that contradiction the truth began to surface. The young woman, recording, tilted her phone slightly, capturing both the agent's declaration and Daniel's hesitation. The man in the suit frowned just slightly, his expression shifting from passive interest to active observation. Because inconsistency in a place that marketed precision was not something easily ignored. Ava finally moved, but only slightly, her hand reaching forward, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough to rest near the edge of the counter, where her identification had been set aside earlier, and she tapped it once, a small controlled motion that drew attention without demanding it. "Then explain that," she said, and her voice remained level, but there was an edge now, not of anger, but of clarity, like a line being drawn that would not be crossed without consequence. Daniel turned the monitor slightly away from the agent, as if instinctively protecting the information on the screen, and that gesture did more than any statement could have, because it revealed that there was something to protect, something that did not align with the narrative being presented out loud. The agent's eyes flicked between them, uncertainty now fully visible, and uncertainty in a controlled environment like this spread quickly because it disrupted the expectation of smooth operation. "Sir," she said quietly, but Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he straightened his jacket, a subtle attempt to reclaim composure before speaking. "There appears to be a system flag," he said finally, and his tone had changed, not dramatically, but enough that those listening could hear it, the confidence replaced by measured neutrality, the kind used when someone realizes they are no longer entirely in control of the situation. Ava nodded once, not in agreement, but an acknowledgement, because she knew exactly what that flag was, and more importantly, what it meant. The room leaned in further, the invisible boundary between staff and guests dissolving as attention converged on the desk. The bellman took a step closer, then stopped, unsure if he should be there, but unable to step away. The concierge shifted his weight, his earlier detachment no longer sustainable in the face of what was unfolding, and the young woman with the phone adjusted her stance, capturing everything now, not just out of curiosity, but because it felt important, like something that would matter later. What kind of flag? The man in the suit asked, and his voice cut through the tension, not loud, but authoritative enough to demand an answer. And Daniel glanced at him briefly, then back at the screen, weighing his response in real time, because whatever he said next would define the direction of everything that followed. Ava remained still, her presence steady, her silence intentional, because she understood that this moment did not belong to her words, it belonged to the system exposing itself, and the more she allowed it to unfold, the clearer it would become to everyone watching that what was happening was not a misunderstanding, it was a pattern, and patterns, once visible, were difficult to deny. Daniel cleared his throat softly. Executive clearance override, he said, and the words landed heavier than expected, not because they were loud, but because of what they implied. And for a brief second the room held its breath. The agent blinked, confusion replacing certainty. That does not make sense, she said under her breath, but loud enough to be heard, and Ava finally shifted her gaze to her, not with confrontation, but with something quieter, something firmer. It makes perfect sense, she said, and this time her voice carried the weight of truth, not revealed fully, not yet, but undeniable enough that the room could feel it even if they did not understand it completely. And in that moment the balance of power began to tilt, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that those who had dismissed her minutes earlier could no longer do so with the same confidence, because something had changed, and once that shift began, it did not reverse, it only accelerated. The words executive clearance override did not fade, they settled into the room like weight. And for the first time since Ava had stepped up to the counter, the space no longer felt controlled, it felt uncertain, and uncertainty inside a place built on precision was something people noticed immediately. The front desk agent blinked again, her confidence now fractured into pieces that did not quite fit together. That has to be a mistake, she said, but her voice lacked conviction because she could still see the flag on the screen glowing in quiet defiance of everything she had assumed. And Daniel did not correct her, not immediately, which said more than if he had, because silence from authority in a moment like this was not neutral, it was revealing. Ava watched both of them, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with the steady focus of someone observing a system under stress, and she could see it clearly now, the structure holding itself together by habit, not truth, by assumption, not verification. And those structures always failed the same way, slowly at first, then all at once. The man in the tailored suit stepped closer, this time no longer pretending to be uninvolved. What does that mean exactly? He asked, and his tone carried the kind of expectation that demanded clarity, not suggestion. And Daniel finally turned toward him, but not fully, as if he was still dividing his attention between the screen and the situation, trying to manage both without losing control. It means the reservation is tied to a restricted profile, Daniel said, carefully choosing each word, as if precision could restore authority. Restricted how? The man pressed, and the question hung there, because everyone within earshot wanted the same answer, even if they did not say it out loud. Ava did not move, she did not interrupt, because this moment was not about her speaking, it was about them explaining, and explanations under pressure always revealed more than intended. Daniel hesitated just long enough for it to matter, then exhaled softly. It means access is limited to executive-level authorization only, he said, and the phrasing was clean, controlled, professional, but it did not erase what it implied. The agent's eyes widened slightly, her earlier certainty now fully replaced by confusion. Then why did it not show up before? She asked, and this time her voice was not directed at Ava, it was directed at Daniel, because the hierarchy had shifted, and she needed guidance. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Ava caught it, because she was looking for it, because she knew that moment when someone realized the system they relied on was no longer supporting them, because it was not accessed correctly. He replied, and the answer was technically accurate, but incomplete, and everyone in the room felt that gap, even if they could not name it. Ava finally spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a clarity that cut through the layered explanations. Or because you did not expect it to be there. she said, and the sentence landed differently than anything before it because it did not challenge the system, it exposed the assumption behind it. And that was harder to defend. The young woman recording shifted her weight, capturing Daniel's reaction, the slight pause, the tightening of his posture, the recalibration happening in real time. The bellman glanced toward the concierge, who now stood completely still, no longer pretending to be occupied because the moment had become too clear to ignore. "We are following protocol," the agent said quickly, as if repeating the phrase could stabilize the situation, but Ava turned her gaze to her, and there was no hostility in it, only precision. "No," she said calmly. "You are following perception and calling it protocol." And that distinction hung in the air heavier than anything else because it named what everyone was beginning to sense, but had not yet articulated. Daniel stepped forward slightly, placing both hands on the counter, not aggressively, but firmly, a gesture meant to re-establish control. "Ma'am," he began, but the word carried a different weight, now less authoritative, more cautious. "We need to verify identity before proceeding with any executive level access." Ava nodded once as if acknowledging the statement, but not submitting to it. "Then verify it," she said simply, and the simplicity of the response removed any room for delay, any space for reinterpretation. It was a direct path forward, and Daniel knew it, which meant he had to act not on assumption, but on fact. And that was the moment where control either returned or disappeared entirely. He turned back to the screen, his fingers moving again, this time with more urgency, more intention, as he accessed deeper layers of the system, the kind not used in everyday check-ins, the kind reserved for internal operations, for management oversight, for situations that required confirmation beyond standard procedure. The agent watched closely, her earlier confidence now replaced by dependence on whatever result would appear next, and Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, because she understood that once a system was forced to reveal its deeper layers, it could not return to its previous state. Not without consequence. The screen updated, another window, another set of credentials, another field requiring authorization, and Daniel paused again. But this time, it was not hesitation, it was recognition. Something on that screen had shifted the narrative completely, and he knew it before he spoke, before he even fully processed it. Ava saw the change, the subtle straightening, the controlled inhale, the recalibration that no longer tried to dismiss, but instead tried to understand. "What is it?" the man in the suit asked again, and now there was no attempt to hide interest, no effort to remain neutral, because the moment had crossed into something undeniable. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned the screen slightly toward himself, shielding it not out of secrecy, but out of instinct, as if buying time would allow him to decide how to present what he was seeing. But time was no longer his to control. Ava stepped forward just enough to close the space between them, not invading, not confronting, just present enough that avoidance was no longer possible. "Say it," she said quietly, and her voice carried no threat, only certainty, and certainty in a moment like this was more powerful than any raised tone. Daniel looked at her, then back at the screen, then back at her again, and in that sequence the room saw it, the shift, the moment. Authority changed hands, not through announcement, but through realization. "The profile is not restricted," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "It is protected." And the distinction landed like a key turning in a lock. The agent frowned, confusion deepening. "What does that mean?" she asked, but her voice was smaller now, less sure. Daniel exhaled again, this time longer, and when he spoke the control in his tone had shifted from assumption to precision. "It means the account cannot be accessed or modified without direct authorization from ownership-level credentials," he said, and the word ownership did not echo, but it settled, and when it did the room changed, not in volume, not in movement, but in awareness. The young woman recording lowered her phone, just slightly, not stopping, but adjusting, as if the moment required a different kind of attention. The bellman straightened fully, the concierge's posture shifted from passive to alert, and the man in the suit took a step back, not out of retreat, but out of recognition, because the space he thought he understood no longer operated the way he assumed. Ava let the silence stretch just long enough for it to settle into everyone present. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, not quickly, not dramatically, just a smooth, controlled motion that drew every eye. Without demanding it, she tapped the screen once and held it at her side, not making a call, yet not activating anything, just holding it there like a reminder that control did not need to be displayed to exist. "So verify it," she said again, and this time there was No room for interpretation, no space for delay, because the system had already spoken, and now it was only a matter of whether those standing behind the counter would accept what it revealed or continue to resist it, and that choice would define everything that followed. The words verify it did not echo, but they held, and for a moment no one moved, not the agent, not Daniel, not even the guests who had already stepped closer without realizing it, because the air had shifted again, not uncertain this time, but heavy with something else, something closer to realization. Daniel looked at the screen, then at Ava, then back at the screen, as if confirming that what he saw had not changed, and it had not. The flag remained, the permissions remained. The profile remained exactly where it had always been. Untouched, unaltered, only now visible, because he had been forced to look deeper than assumption. The agent swallowed lightly, her fingers hovering near the keyboard, but not touching it, because she no longer trusted her interpretation of what she was seeing, and that hesitation spread outward like a ripple. The concierge took a small step forward, then stopped. The bellman adjusted his stance, as if preparing to move, but unsure where to go. The man in the tailored suit crossed his arms, not defensively, but thoughtfully, his earlier impatience replaced by something sharper, more attentive. Ava did not rush, she did not press, because pressure was no longer necessary. The system had already begun to reveal itself, and now it would continue on its own. Daniel cleared his throat softly, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the moment. He reached for a secondary authentication panel, one rarely used in standard operations. His access card sliding into a discreet slot beneath the terminal, the soft click of recognition sounding louder than it should have in the stillness, and then he typed again, slower this time, more deliberate, each keystroke a step deeper into territory he had not expected to enter. When he walked into the lobby minutes earlier, the screen refreshed, new layers opened, restricted fields became visible, and the agent leaned in again, unable to stop herself now because curiosity had replaced certainty. "What does it say?" she whispered, and this time she did not try to hide it. Daniel did not answer immediately. He read, he processed, he recalibrated, and Ava watched him the way she had watched countless executives before, in rooms far from public view, when numbers did not align, when projections did not match expectations, when reality forced a shift in understanding, and she recognized it instantly. The moment when someone realized they were no longer leading the situation, they were reacting to it. "It confirms the reservation," Daniel said finally, and the words landed quietly but decisively. The agent blinked again, her earlier statement unraveling in real time. "But I did not see it before," she said, and now there was no edge in her voice, only confusion, only the need to understand, because it was not meant to be seen at that level. Ava replied, and she did not raise her voice, she did not step forward, she simply let the truth sit where it belonged, and that was when the room changed again, not in noise, not in movement, but in awareness, because this was no longer about a mistake, it was about access, about who was allowed to see what, about who was trusted with information, and who was not. Daniel straightened slightly, not fully reclaiming his earlier authority, but adjusting to a new understanding of the space he was standing in. "Ma'am, I apologize for the delay," he said, and the apology was correct in structure, professional in tone, but incomplete in substance, because it addressed time, not behavior. It acknowledged inconvenience, not assumption, and Ava saw that immediately, because she had heard it before in different forms, in different places. Apologies that attempted to resolve without reflecting, apologies that aimed to move forward without addressing what had happened in the moment before. "This is not about the delay," she said, and her voice remained even, but now there was weight behind it, not emotional, not reactive, but grounded in something deeper, something that did not require volume to be felt. Daniel's posture shifted again, the slight tightening of his shoulders, the recalibration of his stance, because he understood that the situation had not resolved, it had only moved into a different phase. "Then what is it about?" the man in the suit asked, and now his voice carried something else, something closer to alignment, because he was no longer observing from a distance, he was engaged. Ava turned her gaze to him briefly, then back to Daniel, because this was where the focus belonged. "It is about what happened before you checked the system," she said, and the sentence was simple, but it expanded in the room like a lens, bringing everything into sharper focus. The agent lowered her eyes, just slightly, the memory of her earlier words still present, still audible in the silence that followed. Daniel did not respond immediately, because there was no immediate answer that would resolve what had already been revealed. The system had confirmed the reservation, but it had also exposed the process that led to questioning it. and that process could not be undone. Ava let the silence hold just long enough for it to register not as discomfort, but as acknowledgement. Then she reached forward and picked up her identification card from the counter, not abruptly, not defensively, just reclaiming what had always been hers. And the small motion carried more meaning than any statement, because it marked a shift not just in information, but in ownership of the moment. The young woman recording adjusted her phone again, capturing the subtle change. The bellman looked at the concierge, and this time, neither looked away because there was no longer anything to avoid. "We were following standard procedure," the agent said quietly, and this time the words sounded less like defense and more like uncertainty, like something she had always believed, but was now questioning. Ava met her gaze not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity. "Standard for who?" she asked, and the question did not demand an answer, it demanded reflection, and that was harder. Daniel exhaled again, slower this time, the controlled rhythm of someone attempting to stabilize a situation that had moved beyond simple correction. "We can proceed with your check-in immediately," he said, and this time his tone carried more care, more attention to detail, more awareness of what was at stake. But Ava did not move. She did not reach for the key. She did not signal acceptance, because proceeding without addressing the moment would only allow it to repeat later in another form with another person in the same space. "And that was not why she was here. Before we proceed," she said, and her voice remained steady, but now it held the room completely, because everyone understood that this was not finished. "I want you to explain something." Daniel's attention sharpened fully, now no longer divided, no longer uncertain, because he recognized the shift. This was no longer about a reservation, this was about accountability. "What would you like me to explain?" he asked, and the question was careful, measured, open, but Ava did not soften her gaze. "Why, you assumed I did not belong here before you checked the system," she said, and the words landed without force, but with precision, and in that moment the lobby felt different, not like a place of transaction, but like a space of truth, where what had been implied now had to be addressed directly. Daniel held her gaze, and for the first time, since he had stepped into the interaction, there was no immediate response, not because he did not understand the question, but because he did, and that understanding carried weight. The agent shifted slightly, her earlier certainty replaced by something closer to realization. The man in the suit remained still, his attention fixed. The young woman continued recording. The concierge and bellman stood quiet, but present, and Ava did not move, because she did not need to. The moment had arrived, and now it would define everything that followed. Daniel did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than any response could have, because it was no longer about finding the right words, it was about confronting the absence of them. His eyes stayed on Ava, but the confidence that had once anchored his posture was gone, replaced by something more careful, more aware, the kind of awareness that comes when a situation shifts from routine to irreversible. The front desk agent glanced at him, waiting for direction, but there was none, not this time, because the question Ava had asked did not belong to procedure, it belonged to truth, and truth did not come from manuals or systems, it came from admission. The man in the tailored suit shifted his weight again, now fully invested, his gaze moving between Ava and Daniel, like someone watching a negotiation unfold. But this was not a negotiation, it was a moment of exposure. The young woman with the phone steadied her hands, her recording now intentional, not casual, because she understood that what was happening mattered beyond this lobby, beyond this moment. Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, her eyes steady on Daniel. Not demanding, not aggressive, but unwavering, because she did not need to push. The question had already done its work. "I made an assessment based on the information available at the time," Daniel said finally, and the sentence was structured, clean, measured, professional, but it landed flat, because everyone in the room could hear what it avoided. The agent nodded slightly as if supporting him, but even she did not look convinced, because the words did not match what they had all witnessed. Ava tilted her head, just slightly, not dismissive, not mocking, but precise. "No," she said calmly. "You made an assessment before you had any information at all." And that correction did not raise her voice, but it sharpened the air around them, because it removed the safety of phrasing and replaced it with accuracy. Daniel inhaled slowly, his shoulders lifting, then settling as if recalibrating again. But this time the recalibration was different. It was not about control. It was about positioning within a reality that no longer supported his initial stance. "We have to ensure the integrity of the property," he replied, and this time there was a trace of defensiveness, not overt, not loud, but present enough to be felt, and Ava saw it immediately, because that line, that justification, that appeal to protection had been used before in other places under different names, but always with the same effect, drawing a boundary without naming it. Integrity does not begin with suspicion, Ava said, and her voice carried weight now, not louder, but deeper, like something rooted in experience, not theory. It begins with how you treat people before you know who they are. And that sentence did not just land on Daniel, it moved through the room, settling on everyone who had watched, who had listened, who had remained silent. While the moment unfolded, the agent looked down. Briefly, her earlier words echoing back at her not as memory, but as realization. The concierge shifted again, his posture tightening slightly, as if the statement had reached him too. Even though he had not spoken, the bellman glanced toward the exit, then back again, uncertain but present. The man in the suit uncrossed his arms, now his expression no longer analytical, but reflective. Ava let the silence hold again, not to create discomfort, but to allow understanding to form, because rushing past this moment would erase its impact, and she had not come here to erase anything. She had come here to see it clearly. We can correct this moving forward, Daniel said, and now his tone had softened further, not in authority, but an approach, as if offering resolution, as if suggesting that the moment could be closed with a forward step. But Ava did not move. She did not accept, because correction without acknowledgement was not change, it was repetition. Correction is not the same as accountability, she said, and the distinction was quiet but firm, and it settled into the space between them like a line that could not be crossed without consequence. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly again, but this time he did not look at the screen, he did not look at the agent. He kept his focus on Ava, because he understood now that this was no longer about a transaction. It was about something deeper, something that required more than procedure to resolve. What would accountability look like to you? He asked, and the question was careful, open, but also revealing, because it acknowledged that he did not have the answer, and that acknowledgement shifted the dynamic again. Ava did not respond immediately. She let the question sit, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because the answer was not for him alone. It was for the room. It was for everyone who had watched, who had been part of the moment, whether actively or passively. It looks like you naming what actually happened, she said finally, and her voice remained steady, but now it carried something unmistakable, something that did not ask for agreement, but required honesty. Not what you wish had happened, not what sounds better, but what you did before the system told you otherwise. Daniel exhaled again, longer this time, the controlled rhythm of someone recognizing that the path forward required something different than what he was used to offering. The agent looked at him again, this time not for instruction, but for understanding, because she needed it too. The man in the suit remained still, his attention fixed. The young woman continued recording, her phone capturing every shift, every pause, every word, because the moment had become something more than an interaction. It had become a record. Ava stood grounded, her presence unchanged, because she had no need to move, no need to escalate. The moment had already reached its point. I assumed you did not fit the profile of a penthouse guest, Daniel said, and the words came slower than anything he had said before, not forced, but deliberate, as if each one had to pass through a filter before being spoken, and when they landed they did not echo, but they settled into the room with a clarity that could not be undone. The agent's eyes lowered further. The concierge looked away briefly, then back again. The bellman remained still, and the man in the suit nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. Ava held his gaze, and for a moment there was no response, not because there was nothing to say, but because the truth had finally been spoken, and that mattered more than anything else that had come before. And what does that profile look like? Ava asked, and the question was not sharp, not aggressive, but it was precise, and it expanded the moment further, because it required definition, it required specificity, it required Daniel to confront not just the action, but the framework behind it. Daniel hesitated again, but this time the hesitation was not avoidance, it was awareness. He understood what the question was asking, he understood what it would reveal, and still he did not look away. Someone who presents in a way that aligns with our highest tier clientele, he said, and the phrasing was careful again, but it was no longer hiding, it was describing, and in that description the room saw it more clearly than before. The pattern, the assumption, the unspoken standard that had guided the interaction from the beginning. Ava nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because this was the moment the system became visible, not through data, not through policy, but through language, through belief, through the quiet rules that shaped behavior. Long before any system was accessed, then your profile is the problem, she said, and her voice did not rise. It did not need to, because the truth had already shifted everything, and in that moment the lobby was no longer just a place of check-in. It was a place of realization, where what had been invisible minutes earlier now stood in plain view, and could not be unseen. The sentence, "Your profile is the problem," did not raise Ava's voice, but it shifted the entire weight of the room, and for a moment no one spoke, because there was nothing immediate to say. The truth, when spoken clearly, did not invite interruption, it demanded reflection. Daniel stood still, his posture no longer anchored in authority, but in recognition, the kind that arrives slowly, but settles completely. The front desk agent looked at him again, but this time she was not waiting for direction. She was searching for alignment, for confirmation that what she was beginning to understand was real. The concierge lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, unable to stay disconnected any longer. The bellman remained in place, his earlier uncertainty replaced by quiet attention. The man in the tailored suit exhaled softly, his stance relaxed, but his eyes sharp, because he had seen enough in his own life to recognize when a moment crossed from routine into something lasting. Ava did not move. She did not step closer. She did not step back. She allowed the space to hold what had been said, because the weight of it mattered more than any immediate response. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice had changed. It was no longer controlled in the same way. It was measured differently, less about maintaining position and more about acknowledging reality. "That was not my intention," he said, and the sentence was familiar, the kind often used to soften impact, to create distance between action and meaning. But Ava did not look away. She held his gaze, not with challenge, but with clarity. "Intention does not erase impact," she replied, and her tone remained steady, grounded in something that did not require volume to carry weight. The agent shifted slightly, her hands now resting flat against the counter, as if grounding herself in a moment that had moved beyond her understanding. "We treat all guests with respect," she said quietly, and this time the words sounded less like a statement and more like something she wanted to believe. Ava turned her gaze to her, and there was no harshness in it, only precision. "You treat guests based on how quickly you believe they belong," she said, and the correction did not accuse, it revealed, and that made it harder to dismiss. The young woman recording adjusted her phone again, capturing the exchange. The bellman glanced toward the concierge, who now stood fully attentive, no longer attempting to appear uninvolved, because the moment had drawn everyone in, and no one could step outside of it. Now Daniel inhaled slowly again, his shoulders rising then settling, as if preparing for something that required more than a procedural response. "We can address this internally," he said, and the phrasing was careful, but it carried a familiar direction, moving the issue away from public view into controlled space where it could be managed, shaped, softened. Ava did not respond immediately. She let the words sit, because she understood that suggestion. It was not new, it was a common reflex when systems were exposed, to contain the moment, to minimize its reach, to return to normal, without truly changing anything. "This is internal," she said after a pause, and her voice remained even, but now there was a quiet finality to it that settled deeper than before. "This is exactly where it starts." Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in realization, because the boundary he had tried to draw between public and private had just been removed. The room felt smaller, now not physically, but in focus, every person present aware that they were part of something that extended beyond a single interaction. Ava's phone remained in her hand, still inactive, still silent, but present, like a piece of the moment that had not yet been used. And that presence carried its own tension, because everyone could sense that something was about to shift further. "What happens next?" the man in the tailored suit asked, and his voice carried a new tone, not curiosity, not impatience, but expectation, because he understood that the moment had not reached its conclusion. Ava looked at him briefly, then back at Daniel, because the answer did not belong to observation, it belonged to accountability. "That depends on what you do with what you just admitted," she said, and the sentence did not rush, it did not push, it simply placed responsibility where it belonged. Daniel glanced at the screen again, then back at Ava, then briefly at the agent, as if recognizing that this was no longer about a single decision, but about a pattern that had just been named. "We will review our procedures," he said, and the words were structured correctly, but they remained distant. They spoke about systems, not actions, about future adjustments, not present accountability. Ava nodded, once acknowledging the effort, but not accepting the distance. "Procedures did not make that decision," she said quietly. "You did." And that distinction settled into the space again, heavier than before, because it removed abstraction, it removed the ability to shift responsibility onto something impersonal. The agent looked down again, this time longer, her earlier confidence replaced by something more reflective, more aware of her own role in what had unfolded. The concierge shifted his stance, stepping slightly closer to the desk, not to intervene, but to witness more clearly. The bellman's posture straightened fully now, as if understanding that what he was seeing mattered beyond his position. The young woman continued, recording, her focus unwavering, because the moment had become something that needed to be captured, not for reaction but for record. Daniel exhaled again, slower, deeper, as if accepting that the path forward required something different than what he had initially offered. I made a judgment before verifying the information, he said, and the words came without embellishment, without justification, and that made them land with more weight than anything he had said before. Ava held his gaze, and for a moment the room felt still, not empty, not silent, but settled, because truth once spoken clearly did not need to be repeated, and that judgment was based on how I looked, she added, not as a question, but as completion. And Daniel did not look away this time. He did not hesitate. He nodded once, small but visible. Yes, he said, and the simplicity of the answer carried more power than any explanation, because it removed all ambiguity. It named the reality that had been present from the beginning, and in doing so, it changed the entire meaning of everything that had happened before. The agent closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, her posture shifting, not in defense but in awareness. The concierge looked down, then back up, his earlier detachment replaced by something closer to accountability. The bellman remained still, his attention fixed. The man in the tailored suit nodded again, slower this time, acknowledging not just the words, but the significance behind them. Ava let the silence hold again, not to create discomfort, but to allow the truth to settle fully, because this was the moment where understanding became undeniable, and once that happened, there was no returning to what had existed before. She finally lifted her phone, her thumb moving across the screen with a calm, deliberate motion, not rushed, not dramatic, just intentional. And when she spoke, her voice remained steady, but now it carried something new, something unmistakable, something that shifted the room completely. "Carla," she said, and the name did not echo, but it landed with clarity, because it signaled the next phase, not reaction, not emotion, but action grounded in authority. And in that moment, every person in the lobby understood that what had begun as a simple check-in had become something else entirely, something that would not end with words alone. The name Carla hung in the air for a fraction longer than expected, and even before a voice responded on the other end, something in the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively, because names like that did not get used casually, not in spaces like this, not with that tone, not with that level of calm control. Ava did not move as she held the phone to her ear, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but the energy around her had already begun to separate from everything else in the lobby, as if an invisible line had been drawn, and she now stood on the other side of it. "Yes, ma'am." The voice answered, clear, composed, immediate, and the professionalism in it carried a different weight than anything heard so far. It was not reactive, it was prepared. Ava did not raise her voice. She did not explain the situation in detail. She did not need to, because the way she spoke made it clear that context already existed somewhere beyond this room. "Initiate executive protocol," she said, and the words were simple, direct, unembellished, but they landed with precision, because they were not a request, they were a command, and for the first time since the interaction began, the system was no longer something being accessed from the outside, it was being activated from within. Daniel's eyes shifted slightly, his attention sharpening not just on Ava, but on the implication of what had just been said. The agent blinked again, her earlier confusion now replaced by something closer to unease, because she could feel the shift, even if she did not fully understand it. The concierge straightened completely, now his earlier distance gone entirely. The bellman took a half step forward, then stopped, as if instinctively recognizing that the moment was no longer something he could simply observe. The man in the tailored suit lowered his arms slowly, his gaze fixed, because he had seen enough to know that this was not going to resolve quietly. "Protocol acknowledged." Carla's voice continued steady and efficient. "Do you want full audit activation?" Ava paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, because every word now mattered, not for effect, but for outcome. "Yes," she said, "full audit starting now. Log all interactions from the moment I entered the property." And that sentence changed everything because it transformed the moment from conversation into record, from perception into documentation, and once something became record, it could no longer be reshaped by memory or interpretation. Daniel's posture shifted again. This time, not subtle, not contained, the realization landing in a way that was impossible to ignore. "Ma'am, there is no need to escalate this," he said quickly, and the change in his tone was immediate, not controlled, not measured, but urgent. And that urgency carried more truth than anything he had said before, because it revealed what he understood about the situation now. Ava did not lower the phone. She did not turn away. She kept her gaze on him, steady, unwavering. "This was escalated before I spoke," she replied, and her voice remained calm. But now it carried a quiet finality that left no room for negotiation. The agent stepped back slightly, her hand brushing against the edge of the counter, as if she needed something physical to steady herself. The concierge glanced toward the hallway leading deeper into the hotel, as if expecting something to happen from there. The bellman remained frozen in place, his earlier readiness replaced by stillness. The young woman recording did not move her phone, capturing every second, because the moment had crossed into something undeniable, something that would not be easily dismissed. "Audit is live," Carla's voice confirmed. "All system interactions are being logged and archived. Do you want compliance notified?" Ava did not hesitate. "Notify them," she said, and the words were quiet but absolute, because this was no longer about correcting a single interaction. This was about exposing the structure that allowed it to happen. Daniel exhaled sharply, now his composure visibly strained, as he stepped slightly forward, lowering his voice, as if proximity could contain the moment. "We can resolve this internally without involving compliance," he said, and the shift in his approach was clear. He was no longer speaking as authority, he was negotiating as someone trying to limit damage. Ava watched him without expression, because she had seen this before too, the pivot from control to containment, the attempt to redirect the moment into a space where it could be managed instead of addressed. "You had that opportunity before you made your decision," she said, and the sentence landed clean, without force, but with undeniable clarity. The agent shook her head slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if trying to process everything happening at once. The concierge stepped closer, now standing just behind Daniel, not intervening, but no longer distant. The man in the tailored suit spoke again, his voice lower now, but sharper. "What is executive protocol?" he asked, and the question did not carry curiosity anymore. It carried awareness, because he understood that whatever it was, it had already changed the direction of the moment. Ava did not look at him when she answered, because the answer was not for explanation, it was for acknowledgement. "It is what happens when the system is tested," she said, and her tone remained even, but the words carried weight, because they framed everything that had occurred not as an isolated incident, but as part of something larger, something structural. Carla's voice returned again. "Compliance has been notified. They are requesting confirmation of authority." And for the first time, there was a pause, not in uncertainty, but in process, because confirmation mattered at this level. Ava shifted the phone slightly closer to her mouth, her gaze still locked on Daniel. "Authorized under Johnson Holdings executive clearance," she said, and the name did not echo, but it settled into the room with a presence that could not be ignored. Daniel's face changed, not dramatically, but enough, the recognition immediate, the connection forming in real time between the system he had accessed and the person standing in front of him. The agent looked at him, her eyes wide, now fully aware that something far beyond her initial understanding was unfolding. The concierge straightened further, his posture now formal, attentive. The bellman's expression shifted from confusion to realization. The man in the tailored suit took a slow step back, his earlier position abandoned entirely, because he understood now that the hierarchy in the room had been misread from the beginning. Carla responded without delay. "Authority confirmed, executive level 1 clearance recognized, full audit escalation in progress." And with that confirmation, the room crossed a threshold not visible but undeniable, because the structure had just reoriented itself around Ava, not through announcement, but through validation. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if searching for words that no longer aligned with the reality in front of him. Ava lowered the phone just slightly, but did not end the call. Her presence unchanged, her composure intact. But now there was no ambiguity left, no question about position, no room for interpretation. "You asked what happens next," she said, and her voice remained calm, but now it carried something else, something unmistakable, something final. "Now the system answers for what you did." before it knew who I was. And the sentence settled into the space like a line drawn not between people, but between actions and consequences, and in that moment, every person in the lobby understood that this was no longer about a check-in, it was about accountability unfolding in real time. The words accountability unfolding in real time did not fade, they settled into the room like something permanent, and for a moment no one spoke, because there was nothing left to interrupt the process that had already begun. The system was no longer theoretical, it was active, and everyone could feel it, not through sound, not through motion, but through the quiet certainty that what had just been triggered could not be undone. Daniel stood still, his earlier urgency replaced by something heavier, something closer to realization. His eyes moved briefly toward the terminal, as if it might offer an escape, a correction, a way to regain control, but the screen no longer belonged to him in the same way it had minutes ago. It was no longer a tool, it was a witness. The front desk agent stepped back another inch, her posture no longer anchored in her role, but in uncertainty, her hands no longer resting confidently on the counter, but hovering slightly, as if unsure where to belong. The concierge adjusted his jacket, slowly, his movements deliberate, now not out of habit, but out of awareness. The bellman shifted his weight again, but did not step away. He could not, the moment had drawn him in completely. The man in the tailored suit exhaled through his nose, his gaze steady, because he understood something fundamental had just changed, not just for Ava, not just for the staff, but for the space itself. Ava lowered her phone just enough to speak again, but did not end the call. Her connection to Carla still active, still present, because this was no longer a private conversation, it was a monitored process. Begin internal playback, she said calmly, and the instruction was precise, not emotional, not reactive, and Carla's voice responded immediately. Playback initiated, visual and audio logs from lobby entry now active. And even though no screen in the lobby displayed it, everyone felt the shift, because the moment they had just lived was no longer just memory, it was evidence. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze lowering for a fraction of a second before returning to Ava, because he understood now that the narrative was no longer his to shape, it had been captured, it existed independently of interpretation. "Ma'am, we can address this without formal review," he said again, but this time the words lacked force. They sounded smaller, not because they were quiet, but because they no longer aligned with the reality unfolding. Ava did not react to the repetition, she did not engage with the attempt to redirect, because that phase had passed. "You already addressed it," she said, and her voice remained even, but now there was a clarity to it that removed all ambiguity. "You just did it without knowing you were being seen." And that sentence carried more weight than anything else, because it reframed the entire interaction not as an isolated mistake, but as a default behavior revealed under normal conditions. The agent closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, her breathing slightly uneven, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to show that the moment had reached her in a way she could not ignore. The concierge stepped closer, now fully within the circle of attention, his earlier distance gone entirely, his posture formal, but his expression different, more aware, more accountable. The bellman looked between them, his earlier confusion replaced by understanding, not complete, but enough to recognize that something important was happening. The young woman recording shifted her stance slightly, adjusting her angle, as if instinctively trying to capture more than just faces, more than just words, but the atmosphere itself. The man in the tailored suit spoke again, his voice low, measured. "This is being recorded officially now, is that correct?" And the question was not directed at Ava alone, it was directed at the moment, at the system, at the shift. Ava nodded, once not dramatically, not for effect, but as confirmation. "Yes," she said simply, and that single word settled deeper than any explanation, because it removed all doubt. Daniel exhaled again, longer this time, his shoulders dropping slightly, as if the weight of the situation had finally settled fully. "Then I will cooperate," he said, and the sentence was not defensive, it was not resistant, it was an acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement the room shifted again, not in tension, but in direction, because resistance had ended and accountability had begun. Ava watched him for a moment, not assessing, not judging, just observing, because cooperation was not the end, it was the beginning of what came next. "Good," she said quietly, and then she lifted the phone again slightly. "Carla, confirmed timeline capture from initial point of contact." Carla responded without delay. "Confirmed, all interactions from the moment of entry have been logged, including verbal exchanges, tone recognition, and system access attempts." And that level of detail settled into The room like a mirror held up to every action, every word, every pause. Daniel nodded once more, this time not out of habit, but out of acceptance. The agent looked at him, then at Ava, her earlier uncertainty, now shifting into something else, something closer to realization of her own place within what had just been revealed. What happens to us? She asked softly, and the question was not defiant, it was not pleading, it was honest, and it carried through the room, because it was the question everyone was now thinking, even if they did not say it. Ava turned her gaze to her, and there was no anger in it, no satisfaction, only clarity. That depends on what the system shows, and what you choose to learn from it, she said, and the answer did not promise punishment, it did not promise forgiveness, it placed responsibility back where it belonged, and that made it heavier than either outcome. Daniel straightened slightly, not reclaiming authority, but aligning with the process. We will review everything, he said. And this time the words were not distant, they were grounded in the reality of what had been activated. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the shift, not as resolution, but as movement forward. You will not review it alone, she said, and her voice remained steady, but now it carried something unmistakable, something final. This review does not belong to this room anymore. And that sentence expanded the moment beyond the lobby, beyond the staff, beyond the immediate interaction, because it made clear that what had happened here was no longer contained. It had become part of something larger, something that would be seen, examined, understood. The concierge lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again. The bellman stood still, his posture firm. The man in the tailored suit took another small step back, giving the moment space, not out of retreat, but out of respect. The young woman continued, recording her hands steady, because she knew this was the part people would remember, not the beginning, not the confusion, but the shift. Ava finally lowered the phone completely, but did not end the call. Her presence unchanged, her composure intact. You said you follow standards, she said, and her eyes moved between Daniel and the agent, not accusing, not pressing, but holding them in the truth of what had been revealed. Now you get to see what those standards actually produce. And the words settled into the room, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, because what had been invisible minutes ago was now fully exposed, and once seen, it could not be ignored, it could only be addressed. And in that moment, the lobby was no longer just a place of arrival, it was a place where a system had been forced to reveal itself in real time. The lobby did not return to normal after her words, it could not, because normal had already been replaced by awareness, and awareness, once introduced, did not leave quietly, it stayed, it settled, it reshaped how every person in that space understood what had just happened. Daniel stood with his shoulders squared, but no longer rigid, his posture no longer built on assumption, but on acceptance. The front desk agent remained still, her earlier movements gone, replaced by a kind of careful presence, as if she was now aware of every gesture, every breath, every glance. The concierge had stepped fully into the open, now no longer behind the illusion of distance, his attention fixed on Ava with a level of respect that had not been there before. The bellman stood straighter, not out of instruction, but instinct, as if the room itself had redefined what posture meant. In this moment, the man in the tailored suit remained silent, but his silence was different now. It was not observation, it was acknowledgement. The young woman with the phone continued recording, but her expression had shifted from curiosity to something closer to understanding, because the moment had moved beyond spectacle, it had become something real. Ava let the silence hold again, not as a tactic, but as space, because what had been revealed needed time to settle into those who had witnessed it, and rushing past it would only weaken its impact. Carla status, Ava said calmly, and her voice carried through the room without effort, because no one was speaking over her, no one was interrupting. Carla responded immediately, her tone unchanged, precise, efficient. Audit in progress, initial review, confirms deviation from guest engagement standards and flag behavioral indicators inconsistent with executive policy. And the language was formal, structured, but its meaning was clear enough that it reached everyone present. Daniel nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, because he understood exactly what those words implied. The agent lowered her gaze again, not out of shame alone, but out of awareness of her role within those indicators. The concierge shifted his weight slightly, his earlier composure now layered with accountability. The bellman remained still, his attention unwavering. The man in the tailored suit exhaled softly, his earlier detachment completely gone. Ava did not react outwardly. She did not show satisfaction, she did not show anger, because this was not about emotion, it was about truth, and truth did not need reaction to be valid. Proceed with secondary review. Ava said, and her tone remained steady, grounded, and Carla answered without hesitation. Secondary review initiated cross-referencing with training compliance logs and prior guest interaction reports. And that sentence expanded the moment further because it made clear that what had happened here was not isolated. It would be compared, measured, understood within a larger pattern. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward the agent, then back to Ava because he understood what that meant too. This was no longer about a single decision. It was about history, about consistency, about whether this moment was an exception or a reflection. Ava watched him, not accusing, not pressing, just observing, because the system was already doing what needed to be done. The agent spoke again, her voice quieter now, but more direct. "I did not think it would go this far," she said, and the words were not defensive, they were honest. And that honesty carried weight, because it revealed something deeper than the interaction itself. It revealed expectation. Ava turned her gaze to her, and there was no harshness in it, only clarity. "It went this far the moment you decided who I was without knowing me," she said, and the sentence settled into the space not as blame, but as truth. The agent nodded slightly, her eyes still lowered, but her posture shifting, not in retreat, but in recognition. The concierge looked at her, then at Ava, then back again, as if seeing the connection. The bellman's expression tightened slightly, not in discomfort, but in understanding. The man in the tailored suit remained still, his attention fixed, because he had seen enough to know that this moment would not end with simple resolution. "Carla, any prior flags on staff behavior?" Ava asked, and the question was not random, it was precise, directed toward the pattern that was now being examined. Carla responded after a brief pause. "Preliminary data shows minor reports of inconsistent guest engagement, but no formal escalation until now." And that answer carried significance because it confirmed what Ava already understood. Patterns often existed quietly before they were forced into visibility. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering further, as if the weight of that realization had settled fully. "We should have addressed it sooner," he said, and this time there was no defense, no justification, only acknowledgement. Ava nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, because acknowledgement was the first step, not the last. "You did not see it as a problem until it became one," she said, and her voice remained even, but now there was a quiet firmness to it that carried beyond the words. The agent lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting Ava's for the first time since the audit had begun, and in that moment, there was no denial, there was no confusion, there was only understanding. The concierge straightened again, his posture now fully aligned with the gravity of the situation. The bellman remained still, his earlier uncertainty gone, replaced by clarity. The man in the tailored suit shifted his stance slightly, but did not step away, because this was not something to walk away from. Ava let the room settle again, then spoke once more. "This is how systems fail," she said, and her voice carried not just through the lobby, but through the awareness of everyone present. Not all at once, not loudly, but in small decisions repeated until they become invisible. And that sentence reframed everything, not just what had happened here, but how it had been allowed to happen at all. Carla's voice returned. "Secondary review confirms pattern indicators recommend immediate corrective action and policy reinforcement." And the phrasing was formal, but the meaning was clear enough to carry weight. Daniel nodded again, slower this time. "Understood," he said, and the word was not automatic, it was deliberate. Ava looked at him steadily, because understanding was not measured by words alone, it was measured by what followed. "Then act on it," she said, and her voice remained calm, but now it carried expectation, not suggestion, not possibility, but expectation, and that expectation settled into the room like a standard that could not be lowered. The agent took a small breath, her posture straightening, as if aligning with something new, something clearer. The concierge nodded slightly. The bellman adjusted his stance. The man in the tailored suit remained still, but his expression had changed from observation to respect. The young woman, with the phone lowered, it just slightly, still recording, but no longer focusing only on the moment. She was capturing the shift, the change, the transformation. Ava stood, grounded, her presence unchanged, because she had not come to disrupt, she had come to reveal. And now that the system had been revealed, there was no returning to what had existed before, only a path forward defined by what had been learned and what would be done with it. The words "then act on it" did not linger, they moved through the room like a quiet directive, and for the first time since the moment began, action did not feel optional, it felt inevitable. Daniel did not respond immediately, but the shift in his posture was enough to signal that something had changed, not externally, not Performatively, but internally the kind of shift that could not be reversed once it settled. He turned slightly toward the agent, not sharply, not with authority, but with intention. "Step away from the terminal," he said, and his tone was not harsh, but it carried weight, because it was no longer based on assumption, it was based on acknowledgement. The agent hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied, moving to the side, her hands dropping to her sides, not in defeat, but in acceptance. The concierge stepped closer, instinctively filling the space, not to take control, but to support the structure that was being redefined. The bellman remained still, but his attention sharpened further. The man in the tailored suit nodded once slowly, as if confirming to himself that what he was witnessing was real. Ava did not move. She did not interfere, because this was the moment where the system began correcting itself, not through her, but through those who had been part of it. "Carla, initiate immediate personnel review for all staff on current shift," Ava said calmly, and her voice remained steady, but now it carried operational clarity, not just observation. Carla responded without delay. Personnel review initiated, cross-checking staff actions against engagement standards and compliance metrics. And the words moved through the room like a mechanism, activating one step after another. Each one connected, each one unavoidable. Daniel exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders settling into a new position, not defensive, not rigid, but aligned with what needed to happen next. "All current guest interactions are to be paused until reassessment is complete," he said, and his voice had changed again, not returning to its original authority, but reshaped into something more precise, more accountable. The concierge nodded, immediately stepping toward the entrance to quietly redirect incoming guests without drawing attention. The bellman moved subtly to assist, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by purpose. The agent remained where she stood, her posture still, but her expression different, no longer confused, no longer defensive, but aware. The man in the tailored suit stepped back another inch, not retreating, but giving the moment space to unfold. Ava watched it all, without interruption, her presence unchanged, because this was not about her directing every action, it was about the system responding to what had been revealed. "Carla, confirm compliance arrival time," Ava said, and her tone did not shift. Carla answered with the same precision. "Compliance officers are en route, estimated arrival 4 minutes." And that timeline settled into the room like a countdown, not urgent, but definitive. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging it, because he understood what it meant. The review was no longer internal, it was external, it was structured, it would not bend to convenience. The agent took a small breath, her shoulders lifting, then settling, as if preparing herself for what was coming next. The concierge returned to his position, but now stood differently, not behind the desk, but beside it, aligned with Daniel, not in hierarchy, but in responsibility. The bellman remained near the entrance, his posture firm, his attention focused. Ava let the silence settle again, then spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but clearly. "This is where most systems fail," she said, and her eyes moved across the staff, not accusing, not isolating, but including. "They correct the moment, but not the pattern." And the sentence carried through the room, because it did not describe just what had happened, it described what often followed, and what needed to be different now. Daniel listened without interruption, because he knew she was right. He had seen it himself in smaller ways, in reports and feedback, in moments that were addressed quickly and then forgotten, because they did not seem significant enough until they accumulated into something larger. "That will not happen here," he said, and his voice was steady, not defensive, not reactive, but intentional. Ava looked at him for a moment, not judging, not testing, just observing, because words in this moment mattered less than what would follow them. "Make sure it does not," she replied, and the simplicity of the sentence carried expectation, not doubt, not challenge, but expectation. Carla's voice returned again. "Preliminary personnel review complete. Initial recommendation, temporary suspension of decision-making authority for involved staff, pending full evaluation." And that statement landed clearly, because it defined the first real consequence, not emotional, not punitive, but structural. The agent's eyes lowered slightly, but she did not step back, she did not retreat, she remained present, and that presence mattered. Daniel nodded once more, this time, without hesitation. "Understood," he said, and then turned slightly toward the agent, his voice steady. "You are relieved from active duty for the remainder of the shift, pending review." And the words were not harsh, they were not raised, but they carried finality. The agent nodded slowly, accepting it not as punishment, But as outcome, the concierge stepped forward to assume the position at the terminal. His movements smooth, controlled. The bellman adjusted his stance, ready to assist where needed. The man in the tailored suit watched closely, his earlier distance replaced by quiet respect, because he understood that this was not about appearance, it was about structure. Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, because the system was now moving on its own, no longer needing her to push it forward. Carla, log all actions taken post-audit initiation, Ava said, and her tone remained calm. Carla responded immediately. All actions are being recorded, including personnel adjustments, system access changes, and compliance coordination. And that confirmation reinforced what had already become clear: nothing in this moment would be lost, nothing would be reshaped later to fit a different narrative. Daniel straightened slightly, now not reclaiming his previous authority, but standing within a new one built on accountability. We will conduct a full review of training protocols and guest engagement standards, he said, and this time the words were not distant, they were grounded in the reality of what had just been revealed. Ava nodded, once acknowledging the statement, not as resolution, but as direction. Include bias assessment in that review, she added, and her voice remained even but firm. Not just what people do, but why they do it. And that addition expanded the scope beyond action into understanding, because without that the pattern would repeat in a different form. The concierge glanced briefly at Daniel, then back at the terminal, his fingers moving across the keyboard with measured precision. The bellman remained at the entrance, his posture aligned. The agent stood quietly to the side, her earlier role replaced by reflection. The man in the tailored suit exhaled softly, his gaze steady. Ava let the room settle one more time, then lowered her phone completely, ending the call with a simple motion that carried no drama, no emphasis, because the action had already been set in motion. You asked what happens next, she said, and her voice carried through the space with quiet clarity. This is what happens when the system is forced to see itself. And the sentence did not conclude the moment it defined it. Because what had begun as an interaction had become a transformation, not of one person, not of one decision, but of the structure itself. And in that moment, the lobby was no longer just a place where people arrived, it was a place where truth had been seen, and once seen, could not be ignored. The lobby did not feel like a lobby anymore, it felt like a threshold. Something had shifted, not just in action, but in meaning, and everyone standing there could feel it, even if they could not fully explain it. The space that once operated on quiet assumptions now held something sharper, something clearer, something that refused to go back to what it had been. Daniel stood behind the desk, but he no longer occupied it the same way. His posture was still composed, but it was no longer built on control, it was built on awareness. The concierge moved with precision beside him, each action deliberate, each gesture measured, not for appearance, but for alignment. The bellman at the entrance now guided incoming guests with a calm professionalism that carried new weight, not just service, but intention. The front desk agent remained to the side, her earlier role replaced by reflection, her presence no longer active, but still part of the moment, because what she had been part of could not be separated from what was now unfolding. The man in the tailored suit stepped slightly closer again, not intruding but acknowledging that this was no longer something to observe from a distance. The young woman with the phone lowered it slowly, her recording still active, but her attention no longer fixed on capturing every second. She was now watching, understanding, absorbing. Ava stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, her position unchanged, but the room around her had realigned itself completely, not because she demanded it, not because she raised her voice, but because she revealed something that could not be unseen, and once seen it reshaped everything. Compliance entering lobby. Carla's voice came through softly, still connected, still present, and the words moved through the room like a final confirmation, not of escalation, but of transition. Daniel nodded, once his gaze moving briefly toward the entrance as two individuals in dark suits stepped in, not hurried, not dramatic, but precise, their presence quiet, but unmistakable, the kind that did not need introduction because their role was already understood. They walked with purpose, not rushing, not hesitating, their eyes scanning the space, taking in not just the people, but the atmosphere, the subtle shifts, the posture, the silence, the distance between individuals, all of it part of the moment, all of it part of the record. They approached the desk and paused, not interrupting, not asserting, but acknowledging Ava first with a slight nod. One of them spoke, his voice calm, measured. Ms. Johnson, we have full access to the audit feed. And the way he said her name did not echo, but it landed differently than anything spoken before, not because of volume, but because of recognition. And that recognition moved through the room. Like a quiet current, the agent's eyes widened slightly. The concierge straightened further. The bellman held his position. The man in the tailored suit exhaled slowly. Ava nodded once, not in acknowledgement of status, but in continuation of process. Proceed, she said, and her tone remained steady, unchanged, because this was not a reveal for her. It was confirmation for everyone else. The compliance officer turned slightly toward Daniel, his gaze direct, not aggressive, not confrontational, but precise. We will begin with immediate staff statements and system verification, he said, and Daniel nodded again, not resisting, not redirecting, because there was nothing left to protect, only something to address. Understood, Daniel replied, and his voice held no trace of his earlier authority, only alignment with what needed to happen. Next, the second compliance officer stepped toward the terminal, his fingers moving across the interface, with familiarity accessing layers that had only just been opened minutes earlier, his presence efficient, controlled, as if he had done this many times before, because he had. Ava remained still, her eyes moving briefly across the room, not to check, not to assess, but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place, not just in action, but in awareness. The agent looked at her, then quickly lowered her gaze again, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The concierge maintained his position, attentive, composed. The bellman stood steady, his earlier uncertainty completely gone. The man in the tailored suit gave a slight nod toward Ava, not spoken, not exaggerated, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been revealed, and what it meant. The young woman with the phone lowered it completely, now no longer recording, because the moment had moved beyond documentation. It had become understanding. We will need individual accounts of the interaction, starting from initial contact, the compliance officer said, and his tone remained even, not accusatory, not lenient, simply factual. And Daniel gestured slightly toward the agent, not as instruction, but as sequence. You first, he said, and the agent hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, her posture straightening, not in defense, but in responsibility. I questioned the reservation before verifying it in the system, she said, and her voice was quiet, but clear, no longer uncertain, no longer reactive, just honest. And that honesty carried through the room, because it aligned with what had already been revealed. The compliance officer nodded once, making a brief notation before turning to Daniel. And you, he said, and Daniel did not hesitate this time. I supported that judgment without confirming the data, and reinforced it with assumptions about guest profile, he said, and the words came without adjustment, without softening, because the moment no longer allowed for it. Ava watched without interruption, her presence steady, because this was not about her speaking, this was about them naming what had happened, and in naming it, understanding it. The compliance officer made another notation, then looked toward Ava briefly, not asking, not prompting, just acknowledging her presence as part of the process. Ava did not speak, she did not need to. The system was already doing what she had come to see. Initial findings confirmed deviation from engagement standards and bias-based decision-making, the officer said after a moment, and the statement was simple, but it carried weight, because it was no longer observation, it was record. Daniel nodded again, slower this time, because the words now existed beyond the room, beyond the moment. They were part of something that would continue. The concierge took a small breath, his posture still firm. The bellman remained steady. The man in the tailored suit shifted slightly, but did not step away. Ava finally moved, not forward, not back, but just enough to reclaim the space as her own, not physically, but in presence. This is what accountability looks like, she said, and her voice carried through the room, not louder, but clearer than before. Not when everything goes right, but when it does not, and you choose to see it instead of hide it. And the sentence settled into the space like a foundation, something that would remain long after the moment ended. The compliance officers continued their work. The system continued recording. The staff remained present, and the room no longer held tension, it held clarity, and that clarity did not erase what had happened, it defined what would come next. And in that moment, the space was no longer just a place of service, it was a place where truth had been acknowledged, and once acknowledged, it would shape everything that followed. The room did not erupt, it did not dissolve into noise or chaos, it held steady, anchored by something far stronger than reaction. It held the weight of recognition, and that weight changed how every person stood, how every breath moved, how every glance settled into meaning. The compliance officers continued their review, not rushed, not delayed, each action deliberate, each note recorded as if the moment itself demanded precision. Daniel remained at the center of it, not as authority, but as participant his earlier confidence replaced by something more grounded, something that no longer needed to defend itself, because it had already been seen. The front desk agent stood beside him, not behind, not hidden, her presence quiet, but present, because stepping away would not undo what had been part of her actions. The concierge maintained position near the terminal, his posture aligned with responsibility, no longer operating from routine, but from awareness. The bellman remained near the entrance, guiding guests with a composure that now carried intention rather than habit. The man in the tailored suit stood just off to the side, his attention still fixed, not because he had to watch, but because he chose to understand. The young woman with the phone had lowered it completely, now holding it at her side, no longer documenting, because the moment had moved beyond capture. It had become something to absorb. Ava stood as she had from the beginning, still composed, still grounded, her presence unchanged, yet everything around her had shifted to meet it, not through demand, but through truth. Preliminary compliance review complete, one of the officers said, and his voice carried evenly through the space, not loud, not forceful, but certain, the kind of certainty that comes when information no longer needs interpretation. Findings confirm breach of guest engagement protocol and failure to adhere to verification standards prior to assessment. And the phrasing was formal, but the meaning was clear enough to reach every corner of the room. Daniel nodded slowly, not resisting, not questioning, because the findings aligned with what had already been acknowledged. Recommended action includes immediate retraining, mandatory bias assessment, and temporary reassignment of involved staff, pending final review. The officer continued, and the words did not carry punishment. They carried structure, the kind that rebuilt rather than simply removed. The agent took a small breath, her shoulders rising, then settling, not relieved, not distressed, but aware. The concierge glanced briefly toward Daniel, then back at the officer. The bellman remained steady, his posture unchanged. The man in the tailored suit exhaled softly, his expression thoughtful. Ava did not react outwardly. She did not show approval. She did not show disappointment. Because this was not about emotion, it was about alignment between action and consequence, and that alignment was now visible. Implementation begins immediately, Daniel said, and his voice held no hesitation, no distance. It was not a promise, it was a commitment grounded in what had just been confirmed. The compliance officer nodded once, then turned slightly toward Ava. Do you require any additional directives at this stage? He asked, and the question was not procedural, it was acknowledgement of authority. Ava considered for only a moment, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that what came next would define whether this moment became a turning point or simply a correction. Yes, she said, and her voice remained calm, but carried quiet finality. Extend the review beyond this location, include all properties under the same management structure. And the sentence expanded the scope, immediately turning a single moment into a systemic evaluation. The officer nodded again, making a note without hesitation. Understood. Expansion will be initiated, he replied, and with that the impact of what had begun in this lobby extended far beyond its walls. Daniel's posture shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of scale, because he understood what that meant. This was no longer about one team, one shift, one decision. It was about an entire structure being examined. Ava let the silence settle again, not heavy, not tense, but grounded, because what had been set in motion did not need reinforcement, it needed space to take hold. This is not about removing people, she said, and her voice moved through the room with clarity, not directed at anyone, but reaching everyone. It is about removing what allowed this to happen without question. And that distinction reframed the entire outcome, not as punishment, but as transformation. The agent lifted her gaze slightly, her eyes meeting Ava's for a brief moment. And in that moment, there was no defensiveness, no denial, only understanding. The concierge straightened further, his posture aligned with that same realization. The bellman remained still, but his expression had shifted from observation to respect. The man in the tailored suit nodded once more, quietly acknowledging the depth of what had been said. The compliance officers continued their work, finalizing notes, coordinating next steps, their presence no longer introducing tension, but reinforcing structure. Ava finally stepped forward, not to claim space, but to complete the moment. Her movement smooth, controlled, intentional. She reached the counter, and for the first time since the interaction began, she placed her hand fully on its surface, not as a gesture of access, but as a statement of presence the concierge immediately responded, stepping slightly to the side, preparing the terminal not out of urgency, but out of alignment. "Your check-in is ready," he said, and his voice carried a different tone, now not just professional, but respectful, grounded in understanding. Ava looked at him briefly. Then at Daniel, then at the agent, not with judgment, not with dismissal, but with clarity. "It was always ready," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried the full weight of everything that had unfolded, because they pointed back to the moment where assumption had replaced verification, where perception had overridden truth. Daniel lowered his gaze for a fraction of a second, then lifted it again, not avoiding, not retreating, but accepting. Ava took the key card from the counter, her movement smooth, unhurried, and when she did, the action did not feel like the end of a transaction. It felt like the closing of a moment that had redefined the space. She turned slightly, not away, not in dismissal, but in transition, her presence still anchoring the room. Even as she moved, the compliance officers continued their coordination. The staff remained aligned. The guests resumed quiet movement, but with a different awareness than before. And as Ava walked toward the elevators, the sound of her steps across the marble floor carried clearly, not because they were loud, but because the room was still listening, not to her movement, but to what it now understood. And in that understanding, the space itself had changed, no longer defined by who it thought belonged, but by what it had learned when it was forced to see itself clearly. The elevator doors opened without a sound, and Ava stepped inside with the same calm presence she had carried from the moment she entered the building. But now the silence around her felt different, not empty, not neutral, but settled, like something had been resolved, even if it had not fully ended. She turned slightly as the doors remained open for a brief second longer, her eyes moving back across the lobby, not searching, not checking, but observing the space that had shifted in her absence of movement. The compliance officers were still in place, their work continuing. With quiet precision, Daniel stood beside them, no longer directing, but participating, his posture aligned with something new, something that did not rely on assumption. The concierge remained at the desk, his movements controlled, deliberate, each interaction with incoming guests now measured not by appearance, but by process. The bellman guided a couple through the entrance, his tone steady, his posture firm. The front desk agent stood slightly behind, not removed, but repositioned, her attention focused on the conversation unfolding between Daniel and the compliance team. The man in the tailored suit had moved toward the seating area, but his gaze still returned occasionally to the desk, as if the moment had left a mark that would not fade quickly. The young woman, who had been recording, now sat quietly, her phone resting in her lap, her expression thoughtful, as if she was still processing what she had witnessed. Ava did not linger. She did not need to. The moment did not belong to her anymore. It belonged to what had been set in motion. She pressed the button for the top floor, and as the doors began to close, her reflection appeared faintly in the polished surface, not as a symbol, not as a statement, but as a presence, grounded, steady, unchanged. The elevator rose smoothly, the soft hum of its movement filling the space as the lobby disappeared from view, but the impact of what had happened did not remain behind. It moved with her, not as weight, not as burden, but as confirmation. The system had been tested, and it had revealed itself exactly as she expected, not perfect, not broken, but unfinished, and that mattered more than anything else, because unfinished systems could be changed. The doors opened again to a quiet hallway lined with soft lighting and clean lines, the kind of space designed to feel removed from everything below and yet connected in ways most people never saw. Ava stepped out, her footsteps measured, unhurried, each step echoing softly against the floor as she moved toward the penthouse suite, the card in her hand light, but significant, not because it granted access, but because of what it represented: control, not in the sense of power over others, but in the ability to shape what happened within the spaces she had built. She reached the door and paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because moments like this were not about arrival, they were about understanding. She placed the card against the reader, the soft click of the lock disengaging, sounding almost quiet enough to miss, but she heard it clearly. She always did. She opened the door and stepped inside the suite, wide open windows stretching across the far walls, sunlight pouring in over the city below, everything in its place, everything as it should be. But even here, even in this space designed for comfort and distance, the moment from the lobby remained present, not as disruption, but as context. She walked to the window, her gaze moving out over the skyline, buildings rising in layers, streets weaving through them, people moving below, each one carrying their own story, their own assumptions, their own experiences, and she knew that what had happened downstairs was not isolated, it was part of something larger, something that existed in systems far beyond this one. Property far beyond this one interaction, and that was why. It mattered not because it was dramatic, not because it was visible, but because it was real. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, not pressing, not leaning, just present. And for a moment she allowed the stillness to settle around her, the kind of stillness that came after something had shifted, not completely, not finally, but enough to change direction. Her phone vibrated softly in her hand, breaking the quiet without disrupting it. She glanced down at the screen, Carla's name appearing again. She answered without delay. Update, Ava said, and her voice remained calm. Carla responded immediately. Compliance has initiated expanded review across all properties. Preliminary notifications have been sent to regional managers and executive oversight teams. Audit protocols are now active company-wide. And the words carried through the room, not as noise, but as confirmation that what had begun in one lobby had already moved beyond it. Ava nodded once, even though Carla could not see it. Good, she said simply, and there was no need for more, because the process was already in motion. Carla continued. Would you like to address the executive board directly? And the question was expected because moments like this did not remain contained. They reached upward. They demanded attention at every level. Ava turned slightly, her gaze moving back toward the door, toward the space she had just left, and for a brief moment she saw it again, not as it had been, but as it now was, a place changed not by force, but by truth. Schedule it, she said, and her voice remained steady. Not today, not as a reaction, but soon as a directive. Carla acknowledged immediately. Understood, I will prepare the briefing. And the line went quiet again. Ava lowered the phone, setting it on the table beside her, and for a moment, she stood there alone in the space, not isolated, not distant, but centered. Because this was where her work always led, not to moments of confrontation, not to displays of power, but to points of clarity where systems could no longer hide behind assumption. She looked out over the city again, her expression unchanged, her presence grounded, because what mattered was not what had been exposed, it was what would be done with it. She turned away from the window, moving deeper into the suite, not in retreat, but in continuation, because the moment downstairs was not an ending, it was a beginning, not loud, not dramatic, but real. And as the door closed softly behind her, the space held that truth quietly, firmly, like something that would not be forgotten, not by the people who had witnessed it, not by the system that had revealed itself, and not by her, because she had not needed to raise her voice, she had not needed to prove who she was. The system had done that on its own, and in doing so it had changed everything.